Hold up. Yeah. Up.
Hello, good evening. You're welcome to this week's edition of Our Perspective. Like we already know, on Our Perspective, we take up issues that we think bother every part of the world and have a discussion around them in order to have a common perspective. COVID-19 still continues to destroy many things in the world. COVID-19 has brought the world to a standstill. Like you know, in previous editions of our show, we've discussed COVID-19 relative to many other issues. Last week, we discussed the relationship between COVID-19 and 5G and whether all the conspiracy theories were legitimate, and if they were not, what was making all these conspiracy theories fly. Today on our show, we'll be discussing how COVID-19 has impacted or affected journalism. It's very important we admit that in this era of COVID-19, false news is something that we all frown against. And so it means that we need credible information, and that means that journalists or reporters would have to go out and sacrifice or put their life at stake just to get us stories. And now it's important that we hear from these journalists. What do they go through, or what has happened ever since COVID-19 brought the world to a standstill? How are they finding news? How are they getting to report? How are they getting to go out, find these stories, and still make sure that they are safe for themselves and their families? It's also very important for us to state that journalism has become very important, especially in this era of COVID-19. It takes journalists for information from government to get to the citizenry, and the grievances of citizenry to be heard by government. You would realize that many countries have taken to organizing press conferences to do updates on what the COVID-19 situations in their countries are. And so this rightly tells us that even governments admit that it will take journalists play a very important role in the dissemination of information. And so we want to know, the people who do journalism are humans too. They must make sure they stay home like we're all advised. They must wash their hands, they must sanitize, and do everything every normal human being does. But these people do not stay home. They go out to get us stories. So we'll be speaking to two journalists who will be telling us how it feels during this period to be a journalist. Is it a good feeling to be a journalist during this period? What keeps them going? Our first guest is from the most populous African country. Yes, here in West Africa, called Nigeria. His name is Gidado Shoaib. And Gidado Shoaib is the editor of News Digest in Nigeria. And he'll be telling us a lot of things about Nigeria and how he, as a reporter, has been coping and making sure that he still gets to report to his audience correct news. From Ghana, we have Joshua Kojo Mensah, who is a broadcast journalist and a news anchor with Class 91.3 FM. It's also very important for us to note that Ghana has recorded over 1,000 cases of COVID-19 with about 120 recoveries. So it means that we will be having a proper understanding of what is happening in Ghana. And with these high number of cases recorded, doesn't he fear when he goes out? Well, let's dive straight into our discussion. Like the president of Ghana keeps saying, we are indeed not in normal times, and I'm sure even journalism is not in normal times. Can you tell us how has COVID-19 impacted your work as a journalist?
Hello, I'm Gidado Shoaib, the editor of News Digest online newspaper, and the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our work in a range of ways, including how we do our stories. We no longer go out to do in-depth news, find out what's happening, events no longer happen, and no more fundings for the media because everybody's now looking to palliatives for the poor, and no longer consider the fact that also journalists need some form of palliatives to survive. Because the most important people in this period are both the health workers and the journalists, because the journalists keep us informed, journalists keep people informed, we sensitize people, and then while the health workers on the other hand. But I think everybody now is just looking at the health workers, no more priorities to the journalists, who are actually the most important people and one of the most important people in this pandemic. And I think it's necessary for us to also understand that this thing has affected journalists in a way that journalists now find it very hard to carry out their stories.
I believe that jobs around the world have globally
been affected by COVID-19. Journalism has not been left out as one of the jobs that has to feel the pinch of COVID-19. And journalism basically revolves around digging for stories and reporting events, or reporting on events, I should say, as and when they do happen. Now, we have a situation where, due to COVID-19 and its associated lockdown in parts of the world, Ghana has not been left out of that. We also had to experience our own version of the lockdown. Now, sources are unable to move around freely, so basically you are not at liberty to move around and get the stories that hitherto with a phone call you can get someone to lead you to a particular story where you can then continue to dig, because as a journalist you definitely need the sources to survive. Now, this is the situation where the sources are very unavailable, and it makes it difficult. So basically it affects our work one way or the other. Then again, there is the issue of personal interviews. Now, when you clearly listen to interviews, you realize there's a difference between a phone call interview and then an interview where you have that one-on-one encounter with the source or the interviewee.
Well, now we know how COVID-19 has affected your work. Do you mind telling us what has been the significant changes you have realized in your line of work as a journalist?
One of the key things with COVID-19 is social distancing, where you need to cut down on numbers so that we don't get people clustered in an area. So even in my office, one of the things we've had to do is to cut down drastically on the numbers. So instead of having everybody come to work and contribute to the bulletin, the midday bulletin or the news bulletin at 5, we've had to drastically reduce numbers and run a shift system, which hitherto was not the case. So in the mornings you have just about 3 people in the newsroom, and they have had to deal with the tedious task of producing a 30-minute bulletin. So hitherto we would have a full newsroom, people editing, others sourcing and all that. Now that's not the case. So drastically, due to COVID-19, we've had to cut down on the numbers. What else? Great. Now there's also a shift in programming, because because of COVID-19, events like sporting events totally had to be scrapped. So for shows that bordered on sports, now you do not have that liberty to run those sports programs. So drastically, you need to just quickly change the programming list.
The most significant issue that has happened to the line of our work is the changes that have happened to my line of work is that now we're not forced to work from home, and not all journalists are mobile, even if the government says journalists can move from one place to another because of their type of work. But not all journalists are mobile, and there are no availability of local transport or buses to transport them from one place to another. So this is one of the most significant issues that has affected the line of our work. And again, now we are witnessing, let's say, more of digital security. Like we're careful of hackers and fake news who are parading themselves online. And because now we source our information more online, secondary source of information, and we have to make some contacts to make all these things to get the news and everything. But we face these challenges every day, and it's very significant for us to keep our heads right, even though with these changes. But I think we can do better.
Well, once you are reporting, it means you have done something to adjust to the situation. Tell us, what are some of the measures you've put in place to make sure that you adjust to the new changes you have found in your job, and how are you coping with that?
The COVID-19 pandemic, I think, is one of the issues that have come into the world that will reshape a lot, because now we tend to appreciate more of our platforms that are available to us. We now tend to see that we can actually do more even without physically present at each other. It has break some line of communication, but it has fixed some, and it has been able to help journalists find out that you can also use some online media platforms to fact check your story, to source your news. It has given us more time to actually find out where our loopholes are. And I won't lie to you, since the COVID-19 pandemic came, as in our stories, we're using more, our clicks are really going high because more people are sitting at home. So we're looking at what we're doing differently at this time. It has given us more time to concentrate on what we are doing rather than still looking out for other things. We are now more focused because we have no other thing to do than what we're doing. So and this is one of the structural changes. And technologically wise, I think the media platforms, like as I said earlier, the media platforms such as Facebook, the email, the Zoom call are some of the technological advancement changes that we're going to witness on while working after the COVID-19, because people will tend to appreciate communicating more even without physically present, especially here in Nigeria, because we never took advantage of things like this in Africa, most especially because while schooling in England, I figured that we could communicate more email, Facebook, and but now in Nigeria, anytime you need to have a story or you need to communicate with somebody, you always wish to be physically present. But now it is breaking down. We see that now we can now even communicate more effectively, and we're more official, and we communicate more, and we speak more on the issues rather than just talking. And I think this is actually very good, and I welcome every other journalist to also take advantage of this COVID-19 pandemic to make sure they try to see how they can restructure and reshape, so that right after this industry, right after this pandemic, some of our upcoming media outlets like ours will be able to hit the sky and do much better. Thank you very much.
So like I earlier stipulated, we've had to drastically reduce numbers. So now we have to run a shift system, morning and then the afternoon shift. And that also comes in with its own pressure. Few people having to do more in terms of reaching the target, because you cannot go on air and tell audience that, well, we have cut down on the numbers, so we cannot go the full length of the bulletin. No, they would not listen to that. So we've had to drastically run shifts and cut down on numbers. Then there is also the issue of staff having to work from home. So now people do not necessarily have to come to the office. So for instance, at Class 91.3 FM, only on-air staff and a few other staff come to the office physically. Most of the others have to work from home and send stories maybe via WhatsApp, via email, and sometimes interviews need to be conducted via probably Zoom or any other app that can get you the sound you need or the quality you need in regards to your interview. And the company has also made some arrangements for those staff who do not drive. So the company has quickly had to put in more cars into the transport pool, so that people are picked from home directly to the office, and after work are also dropped in their respective homes. So basically,
well, this is one of my interesting questions actually. When you're going out to report, do you feel scared? Do you feel afraid? And has there been any point during this whole COVID-19 period where you felt, look, journalism is not a career I should have chosen in the first place? Have you ever been scared, and have you ever regretted choosing journalism?
As for being scared, I think it's a natural instinct that kicks in, the natural instinct for survival. So yes, I've been scared a couple of times in this COVID-19 phase. It's not, we're not in ordinary times, like the president said. So yes, I've been scared, but as to whether that would make me want to quit my job or regret choosing journalism, hell no. Because this is something that I do basically with the passion. I've had the drive for years, I've been at it for years, and I don't think fear it's something that would drive me away from it or make me regret it. I think basically the aspect of being scared sometimes brings some fun to the whole thing, because you're doing something, you're scared, but then there is that push for you to even go ahead and do more. And basically, I think I have been scared a couple of times, but no, I've never thought about giving up.
I think as a journalist, being scared is not part of it. We all have to just adjust to situations that happen, and we witness so many type of challenges every day. I don't think any journalist has a smooth sail, but adjusting to it is the most important part of it. And I think becoming a journalist is about passion, it's about having interest in what you do. And no matter what the situation, no matter what happens, you just feel, this is the new time for you to adjust to like a new phase of what is happening. And I think don't just know why. I don't just know why. I've never lost interest in journalism for once. Even when I was arrested, even when I had so many court cases I have to be attending, and I just see pandemic is even much happening, and it's much easier. So it's not a thing of being scared. I'm not scared. I find it fun instead.
Well, we are hopeful that COVID-19 will be over one day, and we hope it will be soon. But when COVID-19 is over, what are some of the structural, operational, technological changes you envisage in your line of work as a journalist? And do you think that journalism would be the same after COVID-19?
Yes, on while working after the COVID-19, because people who tend to appreciate communicating more even without physically present, especially here in Nigeria, because we never took advantage of things like this in Africa, most especially because while schooling in England, I figured that we could communicate more email, Facebook, and but now in Nigeria, anytime you need to have a story or you need to communicate with somebody, you always wish to be physically present. But now it is breaking that. We see that now we can now even communicate more effectively, and we're more official, and we communicate more, and we speak more on the issues rather than just talking. And I think this is actually very good, and I welcome every other journalist to also take advantage of this COVID-19 pandemic to make sure they try to see how they can restructure and reshape so that right after this industry, right after this pandemic, some of our upcoming media outlets like ours will be able to hit the sky and do much better. Thank you very much.
In terms of changes that media houses would have to encounter, or what I see post COVID-19, I foresee media houses adopting more technology. Because in this COVID-19 era, what people have had to do is to cut down on numbers. Staff have to work from home. People have to move from the conventional pen and paper writing and go straight to even doing reports and everything online and send them to the offices. So I foresee a future where media houses would practically reduce numbers, ask more staff to work from home, and probably that would also be a real shift. I mean, some media houses have already started practicing it, and I really believe that those that were not practicing it hitherto would also move towards that line. So I see the adoption of technology more in our work as media people, and also probably some cuts in sizes in terms of staff in the office, because journalism, we know, is not in the office, it's out there. So I believe that even after COVID-19, we'll have more staff working from home, working on the field, and not necessarily coming to work.
Well, it's been an interesting discussion, and these journalists have told us their perspective of how they think journalism would be after COVID-19, and they've even told us their experience with journalism during this period of COVID-19. I think that I've got a proper understanding of what journalism is like during this period and what it will be like after COVID-19. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show today. We'll come your way next week with another edition of the show. Bye bye, and thank you very much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe. It's been Our Perspective with me, Abdullahi Abdurrahim na Ninche.
Hold up.